Looking back, there was a time when I thought Jessica and I had the kind of marriage everyone dreamed of. I used to tell people I was lucky, like I'd somehow stumbled into the best decision of my life without even realizing it. It was one of those relationships that felt solid. Like no matter what happened, we'd always have each other's back. We met at a small gathering a mutual friend threw. Nothing fancy, just some drinks and a few people playing cards in the living room. She caught my eye the moment I walked in. Jessica was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. She was smart, funny, and had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. We talked that whole night, and by the end, I knew I wanted to spend more time with her. It didn't take long for things to get serious. We moved in together after a year of dating, bought a house in a quiet suburb 2 years after that, and settled into what I thought was a comfortable, happy life. We talked about starting a family maybe in a year or two. In the meantime, we were content with our weekends spent hiking or binge-watching shows on Netflix, enjoying each other's company. We'd always been in sync like that. I remember thinking how easy it all was. The fights we had were minor. Who forgot to take out the trash or which restaurant to order from, and they always ended with laughter. I believe that Jessica felt the same way. She was supportive when work stressed me out, always there with a kind word or a hug when I needed it. We even talked about getting a dog, something we both agreed would complete our little family. Everything seemed perfect. She was my best friend. We planned everything together, from vacations to house renovations. We had inside jokes, knew each other's quirks, and there wasn't a day I didn't look forward to coming home to her. I didn't just love her, I trusted her with everything. We shared our future plans openly, saving for the next big trip, trying to get in a better financial position to eventually start a family. Back then, I couldn't have imagined anything going wrong. We had this stable rhythm: work, home, the occasional weekend getaway, and I figured we were both content. If someone had told me then that Jessica would betray me, I'd have laughed in their face. That's how solid I thought our marriage was. But I guess you never see it coming when your whole world is about to fall apart. It wasn't one big, dramatic moment where everything came crashing down. No, it started slowly, almost quietly. At first, I didn't even realize anything was wrong. I noticed Jessica spending more time on her phone, not in an obvious way. She wasn't texting in front of me all the time, but it was little things. She'd pick it up during dinner, scrolling through messages or emails, offering vague excuses about work being crazy busy. She started coming home later, saying she had to stay at the office for meetings or last-minute projects. I didn't think much of it at first. She's ambitious, always has been, and she works in marketing, so late nights happen. But then, there were the small changes in how she acted around me. Our conversations, which used to flow so easily, felt stilted. She still asked about my day, but it was like her mind was somewhere else. The warmth, the natural ease we'd always had, started to fade. And the affection, it became forced. Kisses on the cheek instead of the lips, quick hugs that felt more like polite gestures than acts of love. I tried to shrug it off, thinking maybe it was just a phase. Relationships go through ups and downs, right? But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right. I started paying more attention, noticing how her answers to simple questions were just a little too rehearsed, a little too perfect. If I asked about her day, she'd offer up every detail, almost like she'd been preparing for an interrogation. It made me feel uneasy, like she was covering something up. Then, there was this one day. It was the start of everything unraveling. I was tidying up our shared home office, organizing paperwork, and making sure our bills were up to date. I grabbed a pile of mail off Jessica's desk to sort through, and that's when I found it. A credit card statement addressed to her. We don't usually keep secrets about money, but this card was new, one I hadn't seen before. The statement showed a large purchase from a high-end jewelry store downtown, over $2,000, just a week ago. My first thought was that maybe she had bought something for me, a surprise for our anniversary coming up. But then I realized the date of the purchase. She was supposed to have been on a business trip that day, and I certainly hadn't received any expensive gifts. I tried not to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe she bought something for her mom or a friend. But the feeling of suspicion started creeping in. I couldn't shake it. Why hadn't she mentioned it? We've always been open about big purchases, especially something like jewelry. I decided to check the calendar again, just to make sure. The day of the purchase lined up perfectly with a work trip she took to Chicago. She'd been gone for 2 nights, and I hadn't thought much of it at the time. She had business trips every few months. But now, that trip had a shadow hanging over it. Was she really working? Or was there something else? That night, I asked her how her trip went, keeping my tone casual. She gave me the usual spiel. Meetings went fine, lots of networking, glad to be home. But now that I had this small thread of doubt in my mind, I couldn't help but notice how her story sounded rehearsed, too perfect. Her answers came out too fast, like she was trying to convince me instead of just sharing. I didn't press her. Not yet. But I knew I couldn't let it go. Something wasn't adding up. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That credit card statement haunted me. I knew I had to get to the bottom of it, but I didn't want to come at Jessica directly without more information. I didn't want to believe the worst just yet. But the truth? It was eating me alive. I decided to investigate the jewelry purchase. It was simple enough. I'd head over to the store, pretend to be her husband, which I was, and ask some innocent questions. Maybe she bought something for a family member. Maybe I was being paranoid. Or maybe it was exactly what I feared. The next afternoon, I went to the high-end shop downtown. I walked in, trying to look as calm as possible, like any other husband shopping for his wife. A clerk came up to me with a professional smile, and I asked if they could help me find a receipt for a recent purchase made by my wife, Jessica. I explained, casually, that she'd bought something here, but hadn't mentioned it to me, and I wanted to see if I could get a copy. Of course, the clerk said. What's the name on the account? I gave her Jessica's name, and she disappeared behind the counter for a few minutes. My heart was pounding in my chest. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that this was going to be nothing. When the clerk returned, she handed me the printed receipt. Here it is, she said. It was a lovely set of men's cufflinks. Is everything okay with the order? Did you need an exchange? I stared at her, trying to keep my expression neutral. Men's cufflinks? Cufflinks, I repeated, my mind spinning. I didn't realize, were they engraved by any chance? Yes, they were, the clerk said with a smile. A beautiful pair with initials. Let me see. She glanced at the receipt. Engraved with BM. It felt like the ground shifted under me. BM. Those were the initials of my best friend, Brian. I mumbled some excuse about needing to check something at home and walked out of the store in a daze. My legs felt heavy, my head spinning. Cufflinks engraved with my best friend's initials. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. I sat in my car for a while, just staring out the window, trying to wrap my head around what I just learned. Jessica had bought expensive, engraved cufflinks for Brian, my best friend since college, the guy I trusted like a brother. We'd shared so much of our lives together. Trips, weddings, birthdays. He was the last person I'd suspect. But now it all started to make sense. The late nights, the vague business trips, the emotional distance between us lately. This wasn't just an affair with some random stranger. My wife was having an affair with my best friend. It hit me like a ton of bricks. The two people I trusted most in the world had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And here I was sitting in my car trying to figure out how long it had been going on. How many lies I'd been fed over the last few months, maybe years. I knew I couldn't confront them. Not yet. I needed more. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I made my move. After discovering the cufflinks and realizing the betrayal was deeper than I ever imagined, I knew I had to keep my cool. Blowing up at Jessica or Brian would only lead to half-truths and excuses. I needed real, solid proof. Proof that would leave no room for lies or denial. I had to gather evidence, methodically and carefully. So, I became a detective in my own life. The first step was checking Jessica's phone and laptop. I waited until she was asleep, and then one night, I crept downstairs and grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter. My heart was pounding, but I knew this was the only way to confirm what I suspected. She always kept her phone locked, but I'd seen her punch in her passcode enough times to remember it. Her birthday. Once unlocked, I scrolled through her messages. At first, there wasn't anything obvious, just texts from work colleagues, friends, and me. But then I noticed something odd. A lot of the messages she received were from someone named Beth. Only, these texts didn't sound like they were from a female friend. They were vague, cryptic, like, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow," or "That was amazing last night. Same place next week." It didn't take a genius to figure out that Beth was Brian. She'd changed his name in her phone to cover their tracks. That was the first piece of evidence. Next, I checked her email. I accessed her laptop using the same method, waiting until she left for work one morning. She was logged into her Gmail, and as soon as I opened it, I saw a string of emails between Jessica and Brian. They were clever, no obvious love notes or anything, but there were hidden clues. Meeting times, vague references to hotel stays, and even one email with a picture of those damn cufflinks. Brian thanking her for the incredible gift, saying how much he couldn't wait to see her again. I felt sick reading their messages, but I needed to know more. I needed to confirm that this wasn't just a series of flirty emails or stolen kisses. I wanted to know exactly what was going on behind my back. So, I decided to plant a voice recorder in Jessica's car. It was easy enough. I bought a small one online, one that was voice-activated, and tucked it under the passenger seat. I figured if they were meeting in secret, I'd catch a conversation or something incriminating. A few days later, I retrieved the recorder. That night, after Jessica fell asleep, I listened to the recordings. Most of it was nothing, just silence or the hum of the engine. But on one of the recordings, I heard her voice, low and flirty. Then, Brian's voice, responding just as affectionately. They talked about meeting at a hotel near his office and referenced past encounters. That was it, the final piece of evidence I needed. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was cold, hard fact. They were having an affair, and they were doing it right under my nose. As much as it broke me inside to listen to their conversations, a strange sense of calm came over me. Now, I had the truth. I had the evidence, and I had the upper hand. It was time to make my move. Once I had all the evidence I needed, I knew I had to act, but I wasn't going to let my emotions get the best of me. A knee-jerk confrontation would only give Jessica and Brian the chance to twist things, to make excuses, and to downplay what they had done. I wanted something bigger, something that would leave them both completely exposed and humiliated. I didn't just want to confront them. I wanted to tear apart their perfect little world, the web of lies they'd been spinning behind my back. The first thing I did was gather everything. Every receipt, every email, the voice recordings. I compiled it all in a neat little file, along with copies of Jessica's text messages to Brian, saved from her phone while she slept. I even printed out photos of the cufflinks, their little secret gift to one another. With all this in hand, I started planning how to make my move. We had a vacation coming up, something we'd planned months ago, a trip to a cozy cabin in the mountains. Just the two of us, or at least that's what Jessica thought. This would be my stage. This vacation, which was supposed to be a romantic getaway, would turn into the moment I brought their lies to light. Before we left, I made a call to Brian. I kept it friendly, told him we'd love to have him join us on the last night of our trip. After all, he'd been on trips with us before, and it wasn't unusual for us to spend time together. I could hear the surprise in his voice, but he didn't hesitate. Of course, he agreed. He probably thought I was clueless. He had no idea I'd uncovered everything. The next step was setting up the financial side. While Jessica was at work, I took a trip to our bank. I transferred half of our joint savings into an account in my name alone. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this with everything. She'd lose the money, the trust, and soon, her reputation. That night, I acted completely normal. I helped her pack for the trip, chatted about our plans, and even suggested a fancy dinner on the last night. She seemed excited, maybe even relieved, thinking this trip would help smooth over the distance that had grown between us. But I knew better. The first few days at the cabin were almost surreal. Jessica played her part perfectly, kissing me goodnight, holding my hand on hikes, laughing at my jokes. But I could feel the disconnect beneath the surface. She was trying too hard, probably trying to mask the guilt that had been building up inside her. I played along, letting her believe everything was fine. On the last night, I made dinner reservations for us at a small, intimate restaurant nearby. That's when I told her the surprise. Brian would be joining us. I saw her eyes widen for just a split second before she covered her shock with a smile. She was probably panicking inside, wondering how she would juggle both me and Brian in the same room, wondering if their little secret was safe. I didn't give her time to think about it too much. We got ready and headed out to the restaurant. When we arrived, Brian was already there, waiting at the table. He stood to greet us, and I shook his hand as if nothing was wrong, as if I hadn't discovered his betrayal. He gave Jessica a casual hug, but I could see the tension in both of their faces. They were on edge, probably hoping the night would pass without incident. The dinner went smoothly at first, almost too smoothly. We made small talk, talked about old memories, and for a moment, I wondered if Brian and Jessica really thought they could keep up this charade forever. But I had been waiting for this moment for too long. As dessert was being served, I leaned back in my chair and said, "You know, I have a gift for you, Brian." He looked at me, confused but curious. I pulled out a small, velvet box and handed it to him. His face froze as he opened it, revealing the engraved cufflinks, the ones Jessica had secretly bought for him. His initials stared back at him, glinting under the candlelight. "I thought you might want these back," I said, my voice steady but cold. "They were too nice to just leave behind." Brian didn't say a word. His face went pale, his eyes darting between me and Jessica. She was staring at the cufflinks, her face drained of color, her mouth slightly open in shock. I took out my phone, calmly scrolling through the photos and emails I had gathered. "Oh, and Jessica, I also found these. You should probably keep better track of your messages." I laid the phone on the table, showing them the photos of the emails, the text messages, the hotel bills. Everything was out in the open now. They both sat there, speechless, completely exposed. "You didn't think I'd find out, did you?" I said quietly, leaning back in my chair. "All this time, you thought you were so clever. But here's the thing. You've been lying to me, and now you've both been caught." I stood up, tossing a few bills on the table to cover the check. "I've already filed for divorce," I added, turning to Jessica. "By the way, our accounts? I moved half the money. You're not walking away from this with everything. And as for you, Brian," I looked him dead in the eye, "you might want to get ready to explain this to your wife. I'm sure she'll love to hear how you spent your business trips." With that, I walked out of the restaurant, leaving them both sitting there in stunned silence. They had no words, no excuses. Just the cold reality of their betrayal staring them in the face. The satisfaction I thought I'd feel never came. After walking out of that restaurant, after watching Jessica and Brian sit there, stunned and speechless, I should have felt victorious. But I didn't. Instead, I felt hollow. It was as if everything I'd been holding on to, the anger, the betrayal, had left me the moment I revealed their lies, and now there was nothing left but a heavy, suffocating emptiness. I got into the car, but I couldn't drive. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my heart racing. The reality of what I had done, of what my life had become, started to hit me in waves. Jessica, my wife, the woman I had loved for years, had been cheating on me. Brian, the friend I trusted more than anyone, had betrayed me in the worst way possible. And now, I had torn both their lives apart with a few words and a pile of evidence. But for some reason, instead of feeling triumphant, all I felt was loss. I stayed parked outside that restaurant for what felt like hours, staring blankly out the windshield. My phone buzzed next to me, but I didn't pick it up. I knew it was Jessica, texting me over and over, desperate to explain, to plead, to beg for another chance. But what was there to say? What could she possibly tell me that would change what she had done? I had all the proof. I had seen everything. There was no going back from this. Eventually, I started the car and drove. I wasn't sure where I was going at first, just driving aimlessly through the quiet, empty streets. The same streets I had driven so many times with Jessica by my side, back when I thought our marriage was solid, unbreakable. Now every corner, every street sign felt like a reminder of the life I thought I had, the life that was now shattered. I ended up pulling into a motel parking lot. It wasn't anything special, just a dingy little place on the outskirts of town. I figured it was better than going home, better than being surrounded by memories of her. I checked in, dropped my bag in the corner of the room, and collapsed onto the bed, still in a daze. The room was cold, the kind of sterile cold that comes from air conditioning cranked too high and cheap white sheets that don't feel like home. I stared up at the ceiling, my mind replaying everything. The way Jessica had looked at me, the way Brian had paled when I handed him those cufflinks. Their guilt had been written all over their faces, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I'd been holding it together for so long, pretending to be strong, but now, in the quiet of that lonely motel room, it all came crashing down. I wasn't strong. I was heartbroken. I was furious. And I was devastated. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to keep myself from falling apart. Eventually, the weight of everything became too much, and I let the tears come. I hadn't cried in years, not since my father passed, but now I couldn't stop. The betrayal, the lies, the loss, it all poured out of me. I thought about the life Jessica and I had built together. The home we bought, the vacations we took, the plans we made for the future. It was all gone. None of it was real anymore. How long had she been lying to me? How many nights had she come home from Brian's bed, acting like nothing was wrong? How many times had they laughed behind my back, thinking they were getting away with it? The hurt ran so deep, it was like a physical pain in my chest. And the worst part was I still loved her. Even after everything, after all the betrayal, some part of me still loved her. That's what made it unbearable. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to despise everything about her. But love doesn't work that way. It doesn't just turn off because someone breaks your heart. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep. But even in my dreams, I couldn't escape. I dreamt of her, of Brian, of the way things used to be. I woke up the next morning feeling just as lost as I had the night before. I knew what I had to do, though. There was no going back now. I couldn't let her weasel her way out of this. Couldn't let her manipulate me into staying in this broken marriage. I had to move forward, no matter how much it hurt. I packed up my things and left the motel, heading straight to my lawyer's office. The divorce papers were ready, and I signed them without hesitation. I thought about sending Jessica a message, telling her it was over, that I had filed, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. She didn't deserve an explanation from me. She had made her choice. As I left the lawyer's office, I felt a strange sense of finality. This was the beginning of the end. My life as I knew it was over, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe it was time for something new. Filing for the divorce should have felt like the final step, the last act of cutting Jessica out of my life. But the truth is, things didn't end as cleanly as I had hoped. The moment I left the lawyer's office, it all started: the phone calls, the texts, the emails. Jessica wasn't going to let go without a fight. At first, I ignored her messages. My phone buzzed constantly, each notification like a jolt to my already frayed nerves. Jessica had gone from tearful apologies to furious accusations, flipping between desperation and anger. 1 minute, she was begging for forgiveness, claiming it had been a mistake, that it wasn't what it seemed. The next, she was lashing out, blaming me for setting her up, accusing me of never loving her enough in the first place. It was exhausting, but I held my ground. I wasn't going to respond. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of thinking she could manipulate me with her lies again. The first time she showed up at my parents' house, I wasn't surprised. She knew I had been staying with them since the confrontation. I heard her car pull into the driveway late in the evening, just as I was sitting down for dinner with my mom and dad. My mom gave me a worried look when we heard the knock on the door. "It's her, isn't it?" My mom asked, her voice soft but tense. I nodded. "Yeah, just stay here. I'll deal with it." I didn't want my parents getting dragged into this mess. They'd been nothing but supportive, taking me in when I couldn't stand to be in the house I shared with Jessica anymore. They'd been as shocked as I was when they found out about the affair, especially since Brian had been over for family barbecues and holidays more times than we could count. I opened the door, and there she was. Jessica looked disheveled, her eyes red from crying. She was clutching her phone, her hands shaking, as if she had been waiting for me to respond to her messages all day. "We need to talk," she said, her voice hoarse. "Please, just let me explain." I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at her, taking in the sight of the woman I had once loved, the woman I had trusted more than anyone. Now all I saw was someone who had torn my life apart. "There's nothing left to explain," I finally said, my voice cold. "I know everything. You lied. You cheated. And I've already filed for divorce. This is over, Jessica." She stepped forward, her eyes wide, pleading. No, Mark, you don't understand. It's not what you think. Brian, he meant nothing to me. It was a mistake, a horrible mistake. I love you. Please, just give me a chance to fix this. I shook my head. A mistake? That's all you've got? You spent months sneaking around behind my back, lying to my face, and now you want me to believe it was just a mistake? Do you even hear yourself? Tears streamed down her face as she stepped closer, her voice cracking. I wasn't thinking straight. I was lost, confused. I felt like we were drifting apart. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe, my expression hard. You didn't mean for it to happen? You bought him gifts, stayed in hotels with him, lied to me over and over. You didn't just fall into this, Jessica. You chose it, every step of the way. She broke down completely then, sobbing uncontrollably. Please, Mark, I'll do anything. I'll go to counseling. I'll quit my job if that's what it takes. Just please don't throw everything away. I could feel the anger rising inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to let her see me crack. I'm not the one who threw everything away. You did, and now you have to live with that. Her sobs turned to desperate gasps as she collapsed against the doorframe, grabbing onto my arm. Mark, please don't leave me. I'll never do it again, I swear. I love you. I can't live without you. I felt nothing but cold detachment as I pulled my arm away. It's too late, Jessica. I'm done. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with desperation. What about us? What about everything we've built together? I stared at her for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Everything we had built together. It felt like a distant memory now, something from another lifetime. Our home, our plans, our future, it was all gone, destroyed by her betrayal. There is no us anymore, I said quietly. You made sure of that. I stepped back into the house and shut the door, the sound of her sobbing muffled as I walked away. I knew she would keep trying. She'd send more messages, show up again, beg for another chance. But I was done. There was nothing she could say or do to fix this. I went back to the dinner table, trying to act like I hadn't just faced down the woman who had shattered my life. My mom gave me a sympathetic look as she handed me the mashed potatoes. You okay? She asked softly. I forced a smile. Yeah, I'll be fine. But deep down, I wasn't sure. The reality of the divorce, of the end of everything I had built with Jessica, was starting to hit me harder than I had anticipated. I had one sure. I had exposed her for what she was and made my escape. But there was no victory in this, only loss. The days that followed were a blur. I focused on work, throwing myself into projects, trying to stay busy. I blocked Jessica's number, cutting off her desperate attempts to contact me. I knew it was over, but that didn't make the pain go away. It was always there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to remind me that the life I thought I had was gone forever. And as much as I wanted to believe I was moving on, the truth was I wasn't. Not yet. After everything that had happened with Jessica, I thought I was done. I thought I had torn down the facade of my life enough and that I'd never have to see Brian again. But things rarely end so neatly. He hadn't reached out after the dinner, which I took as a sign that he knew how deeply he had betrayed me. But deep down, I knew that sooner or later, we'd have to face each other. I got my answer one Saturday morning, a few weeks after I had filed for divorce. I was at my parents' house, trying to enjoy a quiet breakfast. I had been staying with them for a while, trying to figure out my next steps, finding a place of my own, finishing the divorce proceedings, and figuring out how to rebuild my life. It was a simple routine, but it gave me a sense of normalcy after the storm. That morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with my dad, I heard a car pull into the driveway. At first, I didn't think anything of it, until I heard the heavy knock at the front door. My dad and I exchanged a look. He started to stand up, but I knew who it was even before I got to the door. Sure enough, when I opened it, there was Brian. He looked a mess, his hair unkempt, dark circles under his eyes. He wasn't the polished, confident guy I had known for years. He looked more like a man who had been living on the edge, desperately trying to keep his life from falling apart. Good. Mark, he said, his voice quiet but strained. Can we talk? I wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him I had nothing to say to him. But instead, I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. My dad didn't need to hear this conversation. This was between me and Brian. What do you want? I asked, my voice cold and flat. He shifted nervously, looking down at the ground before meeting my eyes. I know I messed up, Mark. I know I did. I'm not here to make excuses. I need to talk to you. I need to make things right. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Make things right? Brian, how the hell do you expect to make this right? You had an affair with my wife. You were my best friend, and you slept with Jessica behind my back for months. There's no making this right. He swallowed hard, the guilt written all over his face. I know I screwed up in the worst possible way, and I can't take it back. But please, just let me explain. It wasn't like that. It wasn't some long affair. It just happened. I never meant for it to go this far. I shook my head, disgusted by his pathetic attempts to downplay what had happened. It just happened? Don't insult me, Brian. I have all the evidence. You two planned this. You lied to my face. This wasn't some mistake. You both knew exactly what you were doing. He looked like he was going to be sick, but I didn't care. He deserved every ounce of the guilt he was carrying. I had trusted him, shared my life with him, and he had thrown it all away for what? A few nights with my wife? I'm not here to make excuses, Brian said, his voice breaking. I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. You're like a brother to me, and I know that's the last thing you want to hear right now, but it's the truth. I don't know how I let it happen. I was in a bad place. My marriage was falling apart, and I turned to Jessica for comfort. But I swear to you, I never stopped caring about our friendship. I hate myself for what I did. I stared at him, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. It took everything I had not to lash out, not to let the fury bubbling inside me erupt. But I kept my cool. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply he had hurt me. Do you hear yourself? I asked, my voice sharp. You turned to Jessica for comfort? You're trying to justify this as some kind of emotional mistake? You didn't just have an affair with my wife, Brian. You betrayed me. You betrayed every bit of trust we had. He lowered his head, his hands shaking. I know, Mark. I know. And I'll never forgive myself for it. But I don't want to lose you. I can't lose you as a friend. We've been through too much together. Please, just tell me what I can do to make this right. The nerve of him asking for a solution like this could be fixed infuriated me. I had lost my wife, my home, and now he was asking me to help him salvage our friendship? There's nothing you can do, I said, my voice cold as ice. There's no fixing this, Brian. You're not my friend anymore. You made sure that the moment you touched Jessica, you threw away everything we had. And for what? A few nights in a hotel? He winced at the words, but I wasn't finished. I stepped closer, my fists clenched at my sides. You don't deserve my forgiveness, and you don't deserve to be in my life. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to walk away. You're going to stay out of my life. You're not going to call me. You're not going to text me. And you're sure as hell not going to show up at my house again. You don't exist to me anymore. Tears welled up in his eyes as he looked at me, his face twisted in guilt and regret. Mark, please. Get off my property, Brian, I said firmly, cutting him off. We're done. He stood there for a moment, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. But I was done with him. There was nothing left to say. I turned and walked back into the house, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against the door for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. My dad looked up from the table, his eyes full of concern. You okay? I nodded, but the truth was I wasn't sure. Facing Brian hadn't given me the closure I thought it would. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, and I didn't know how to make it go away. As I sat down at the table, my dad put a hand on my shoulder. It'll take time, son, he said softly, but you'll get through this. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that one day I'd wake up and not feel the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. But right now, it felt impossible. The confrontation with Brian left me emotionally drained, but oddly enough, it also brought a sense of finality. It was like closing a book, one that had been filled with years of friendship and trust, only to be torn apart in the last few chapters. As I sat at my parents' dinner table that night, I realized something. I couldn't keep living in the past. What Jessica and Brian had done was unforgivable, but I couldn't let their betrayal define me forever. The days that followed were difficult, but I forced myself to take small steps forward. I focused on practical things, meeting with my lawyer, finding a new place to live, and settling the divorce proceedings. There was something strangely therapeutic about handling the legal side of things. It felt like I was taking back control piece by piece. Every paper I signed, every meeting I attended brought me closer to closing this painful chapter. I found a small apartment across town, nothing special, but it was mine. It wasn't the house Jessica and I had shared, the one filled with memories that now felt more like ghosts haunting the place. It was a fresh start, an empty space that I could fill with whatever I wanted. The day I moved in, my mom helped me unpack the essentials, clothes, kitchen supplies, and some of the books I'd managed to grab before I left the house. My dad set up the TV, making sure it worked before sitting down with a sigh, the two of us sharing a quiet moment as we looked around the bare living room. "You'll be all right here," he said, his voice steady. "It's not much now, but it'll become a home." I wanted to believe him, but the emptiness of the space made it hard to imagine. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "It's a start." That night, after my parents left, I sat on the couch, staring at the blank walls. The silence felt deafening. I didn't know what to do with myself. It wasn't the physical space that bothered me. It was the absence of all the things I had taken for granted for so long. The routine of being married, the comfort of thinking you knew where your life was headed. Now I had no idea what the future held. To fill the silence, I started going to the gym. I hadn't been in months, but the physical effort was something I could control. The burn in my muscles, the sweat, the steady rhythm of the treadmill. It kept my mind from wandering back to Jessica and Brian. I pushed myself harder than I ever had before, using the pain to drive out the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. Gradually, the routine helped. I started feeling stronger, more focused. I was no longer obsessing over what had happened, no longer replaying the conversations in my head. Instead, I began to think about what I wanted to do next. It wasn't just about surviving the divorce. It was about figuring out how to rebuild my life on my own terms. Work became another refuge. I started taking on more projects, staying late at the office, diving into details I would have delegated before. It wasn't just about distraction, it was about proving to myself that I could move forward. My boss, Tom, noticed the change. One afternoon, he called me into his office. "You've been killing it lately," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I know things have been rough, but it looks like you're channeling that energy in the right direction." I nodded, not really knowing how to respond. "It's been a good distraction," I admitted. He gave me a thoughtful look. "Distraction's fine for now. But don't lose sight of what you really want out of life, Mark. This situation, it's temporary. You'll come out the other side stronger. Trust me." I didn't fully believe him, not yet, but I appreciated the sentiment. It was the first time since the divorce that someone had talked about the future like it wasn't something to dread. Maybe Tom was right. Maybe I would come out of this stronger, even if it didn't feel that way yet. I started reconnecting with old friends, people I hadn't seen much during my marriage. At first, it felt strange, like I was trying to step back into a life I had left behind. But gradually, I began to enjoy it. Grabbing drinks after work, going to a ball game, even just hanging out at someone's place for a low-key evening. It reminded me that there was still life to be lived beyond the wreckage of my marriage. Slowly, things started to feel manageable. I wasn't healed, and I wasn't about to pretend everything was fine. But I wasn't drowning anymore either. I was moving forward one step at a time,